She was an Apache woman, paralyzed, cast into the raging river by her own kin, left for dead until a lone cowboy plunged in to drag her from that watery grave. Before we get deeper into this tale, do us a favor, like this video, and let us know, down in the comments just where you're watching from. The sky over the Verde River was a bruised, heavy gray, pressing low with a bitter promise of more cold before dark. For days the rain hadn't quit, leaving the ground a saturated, slick mud that tried to steal a man's boots. Silas Thorne was working his fence line, the one that skirted the water's edge, sinking nails into a post he'd hewn himself last autumn. The labor was good. It kept his hands occupied, and Lord knew he needed that. Ever since he'd turned his back on the cattle drives and the bloody life of a hired gun, the silence out here had been both his salvation and his penance. At 38, Silas had made a hard peace with the quiet. He'd bought this scrap of land 2 years back, right after he walked away from the kind of killing that hollows a man out from the inside. Out here, there were no showdowns, no bounties, no ghosts to call him by name. There was just the land, the river, and the steady ring of his hammer striking pine. He'd been at it since sunup, sweat and drizzle mingling on his brow, when the wind turned and carried something sharp through the air. A cry. He went still, hammer raised. That wasn't the complaint of a stressed limb or the sound of a predator. It was human. A woman's voice, thin, desperate, and drowning. He spun toward the river. The current was a roaring, swollen brown torrent, choking on branches and debris. Nothing. Then a flash of motion, a snag of dark cloth, an arm flailing above the surface before the river dragged it back under. Silas didn't hesitate. The hammer fell from his grip as he sprinted. The mud fought him, sucking at his boots, the slope a slick mess from the storm, but he drove himself harder, his heart slamming his ribs. He hit the bank and scanned the torrent, just the roar of the water. Then he saw her again. A shock of black hair, the curve of a shoulder, the weakest flutter of a hand. He ripped his coat off and dove. The water was pure ice, a shock so profound it punched the air from his lungs. It felt like claws scraping his chest, but he fought it, pulling with all his strength against the river's might. The current was stronger than it looked, every stroke a heavy, losing battle. He saw her again, snagged in a tangle of reeds near the far bank, her head lolling back, mouth just clear of the surface. He reached her, clamped an arm across her chest, and kicked for the shore. The sodden weight of her dress was an anchor, dragging them both down, but he refused to let go. By the time he hauled her onto the mud, his lungs were burning and his arms shook with raw exhaustion. He rolled her over, pressed his ear to her, back. A heartbeat, faint, stuttering. He pushed steady on her spine, forcing the river water out. She choked, a terrible gasp, and finally dragged in a shallow, ragged breath. "Easy," he rasped, his voice raw. "You're safe now." Her eyes snapped open, dark brown, glazed, and wild. She tried to move, to shift, but her legs lay limp and useless. Silas saw the terror flash in her eyes an instant before she understood. It herself. Her hand slapped the mud, trying to push up, but her lower body remained dead weight. Her breathing hitched, coming fast and shallow. "It's all right," he said, his voice low. "You're hurt. Don't fight it." She stared at him, lips trembling, trying to form words. What escaped was broken English, tangled with Apache. "No walk, no walk." He understood. The words struck him harder than the cold water. He'd seen men broken by bad falls, shot clean off their saddles. He knew how fast that terror curdled into shame. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, her features sharp and beautiful, even coated in mud and chilled to the bone. Her long black hair was plastered to her neck, her dress torn and heavy. Whoever she was, she hadn't just slipped and fallen in. He scanned upriver, half expecting to see riders, a camp. Something. There was nothing. Just the wind howling through the gray trees. "You're coming with me," he said, sliding his arms under. She didn't fight him. She just closed her eyes as he stood, lifting her dead weight. She was a dead weight in his arms, her body limp save for the violent shudders of cold. The climb up the ridge was a brutal fight, every step a war against the sucking mud and raw. Exhaustion. He had to stop once, gasping for air, feeling the faint, frantic bird beat of her pulse against his ribs. She murmured something in her own tongue, a name, maybe a prayer, and then fell slack again. By the time he reached the cabin, his arms were numb, screaming with the effort. He kicked the door open and laid her gently on the cot against the wall. The fire was nothing but dying embers. He threw scrap wood onto the coals, blowing until the flames finally caught, filling the small room with a sharp, dry heat. He grabbed a wool blanket, shucked his own wet shirt, and wrapped her tightly. Her skin was a pale, waxy color, her lips nearly blue. When her eyes fluttered open again, she whispered, "Why you help?" Silas stared at her, the question hanging in the air. "River's no place to die," he said simply. He gave her water from the dipper, holding the cup steady when her hands shook too badly to grip it. She tried to voice a thank you, but her voice cracked and broke. When she turned her face to the wall, he saw the tears, small, silent, and fast. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask how. Not yet. He just stoked the fire hotter and kept his watch. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving only the distant low roar of the river. She was asleep soon, her breathing shallow beneath the blanket. Silas sank into his chair, staring into the flames. He felt that familiar weight settle in, his chest the same one he'd carried since he left the blood and noise of the trail towns behind. He didn't know who she was or what kind of hell had spat her out, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her die here. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of the very river that had almost claimed her. For the first time in 2 long years, Silas Thorne didn't feel entirely alone. Morning came slow, a weak, pale light filtering through the chinks in the cabin walls. The fire had burned low again, and the air held the sharp bite of dawn. Silas was still in the chair where he'd slept in fits, one arm draped over his knee, his eyes half-lidded but alert. He hadn't meant to sleep at all. When he glanced at the cot, she was awake. Tali's eyes were open, tracking him with a quiet intensity. Her black hair was dry now, fanned out on the rough pillow, the blanket pulled up to her chin. She said nothing, at first. He saw her fingers flex under the wool, testing her hands, her arms. Then she tried to move her legs. Nothing. Her face went utterly still. He watched, caught between the decency of looking away and the need to stay. She pressed her palm hard against her thigh, then again harder until raw frustration tightened her jaw. Finally, she turned her gaze to him. "You say I safe," she said, her voice soft but brittle. "I'm not safe. No walk, no tribe, no home." Silas stood, pouring water from the tin pitcher into a mug. "You're alive," he said, setting it beside her. "That's safe enough for now." She ignored the water. "Why you save me?" He hesitated. The question had been sitting in the room with them all night. "Didn't think on it," he said. "Just saw you in the water. Couldn't just stand there." Her eyes searched his face as if she couldn't believe a man would act without a reason. Or maybe she'd just never seen one. After a long, heavy silence, she whispered, "My people. Throw me. Say I bring bad spirit. I fall from horse, spine break, they say curse." He felt something twist low in his gut. He'd known Apache camps during his scouting days, seen how hard they lived, pressed by the army on one side and starvation on the other. But the thought of them turning on one of their own, like this, it made his hands clench into fists. "You fell from a horse," he said, his voice flat. "That's no curse." She didn't argue. Her gaze drifted back to the fire. Silas moved around the small cabin, needing to do something. He set beans to soak, then grabbed his axe and went back outside. Each heavy strike of the axe splitting logs cleared his head a little. He thought about her story, about how superstition and fear could make people throw away a life just to feel clean. He thought about her weight when he'd carried her up the bank, light as a girl, but heavy with a burden he couldn't yet name. Inside, she listened to the sounds of him working, the steady thwack of the axe, the creak of the door, the snap of the fire. When he came back in, she had managed to push herself upright, bracing on her elbows. You live alone, she stated, her eyes taking in the room. The tools, the saddle on its rack, the rifle by the door. Yeah, he answered. A while now. Why? He kept his gaze fixed on the rough-hewn walls anywhere but her face. Got tired of fighting other people's battles. She watched him, her stare unsettlingly sharp. You soldier. He hesitated, the past washing over him like cold water. He gave a single stiff nod. Was a long time ago. Drove cattle after that. Then I stopped doing both. The silence that settled wasn't heavy or awkward. It was just there, a quiet space that seemed to belong to them both equally. He handed her a bowl of hot broth, his calloused hand covering hers to keep the cup steady. She had the strength to lift it, but the tremors wouldn't quit. When she finished, her eyes roamed the small room again, landing on the single window, then on him. This your land? Bought it 2 years back, he said. Built this cabin myself. She nodded slowly, taking it up. She swallowed, the sound loud in the tense quiet. If you send, I die. He met her eyes. There was no plea in her voice, no drama, just the cold, hard truth. The words landed in the small room with the weight of an anvil. Silas nodded slowly. Then you'll stay for now. Something in her face eased, the deep lines of fear softening, though she didn't smile. She just looked at him with a quiet understanding, as if she'd known his answer before he did. As night fell again, the fire burned steady. She lay on the cot, her eyes drifting shut. Silas sat nearby, the familiar weight of his rifle across, his knees, his hands moving automatically, oiling the action out of pure habit. The cabin timbers groaned in the cold. Neither spoke. He didn't know what kind of trouble might follow her, or if anyone would come looking. But as he watched the shallow rise and fall of her breath, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever had started on that riverbank wasn't finished. And for the first time in years, Silas Thorne felt the weight of another life depending on him, and he didn't run from it. The days that followed were cold and still. The storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and brittle, and the river below had calmed to a slow, dark current. Silas rose early each morning, same as always. But now, the sound of his boots on the floorboards didn't echo in an empty room. Every time he turned from the stove or the door, she was there, awake, watching him. Silent, but present. Tali was getting stronger. She could sit up longer now, move her arms with more freedom, even drag herself short distances across the floor when she needed to. It wasn't much, but it was something. Silas had nailed together a rough frame from scrap lumber, something to help her prop herself up beside the fire. He didn't say it, but he admired her grit, the way she refused to be useless, even when her own body had failed her. That morning, as he poured coffee into a tin cup, she broke the silence. You work every day, she said, her English halting but steady. Work keeps me straight, he replied, not looking up. Straight? He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. Means I don't lose myself. Don't come apart. She studied him a long moment, then nodded. You lose. Before. He froze, caught flat-footed by her directness. He'd told her almost nothing about himself, just that he'd worked cattle, that he'd worn a uniform once. He'd damn sure hadn't said why he lived out here like a hermit. Yeah, he said, the word heavy. Lost enough. She didn't press him, but the look she gave him said she understood more than most. She knew what it meant to be cut off from everything you were. Later that day, as the wind began to howl outside, she asked him the other question, the one that had been hanging in the air since he'd pulled her from the water. You not afraid? He looked up from the bridle strap he was mending. Of what? Me, she said simply. My people. You help Apache woman, many white men. They would not do that. Silas set the leather aside, rubbing the tight muscles in the back of his neck. I worked territory near Apache lands before, saw plenty of bad on both sides. You don't strike me as trouble. Her eyes held his, testing the weight of his words. I not cursed. He shook his head, his voice firm. You're just hurt, Tali. That's all it is. Something small in her expression fractured, like a wall crumbling just enough to see through the hard tension that had lived in her jaw since that night finally began to ease. By evening, the first flakes of snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier, blanketing the ridge in a silent white. The cabin filled with the smell of wood smoke and simmering beans. Silas helped her to the small table, setting her on a stool he'd braced with blocks to keep her steady. She stirred the pot while he sliced bread, the two of them working in a shared, quiet rhythm. Anyone listening might have wondered at the silence, but words weren't something either of them trusted. Silas had spent years riding with men who lied, as easily as they breathed. Outlaws, officers, ranchers who'd smile as they cheated you blind. Talk was cheap. Work was honest. Tali understood that without him needing to say a word. Every small movement between them, her hand steadying the bowl, his arm reaching past her for the kettle, said more than words ever could. After they ate, she spoke softly into the quiet. You not asked me name before. He looked at her across the table. Didn't think you were ready to give it. Her lips curved in that faint, uncertain smile. Tali, she said. It means eternal blossom. But I think no bloom. Left. He held her gaze for a long moment. You're still breathing, ain't you? She nodded once. Then maybe the bloom ain't gone yet, he added, his voice low. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It settled over the room like the snow outside, soft, unspoken but alive. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, Silas sat by the fire again. He turned over the questions that hung over both of them. What had really happened with her tribe, whether anyone would come looking for her, and what the hell he'd do if they did. He thought about the life he'd built here. A fortress meant to keep the world out, and how easily she had breached it without ever asking permission. He couldn't tell if it was pity or duty or something else entirely, something he had no name for, but he knew this much. Sending her away wasn't an option anymore. She needed care, and maybe, just maybe, he needed something to care for. Outside, the distant howl of wolves echoed deep in the valley. Inside, the firelight danced across the walls, tracing the lines of the small cabin that had been his only company. Now there were 2 mugs by the stove, 2 blankets on the cot, and a quiet warmth that hadn't lived there in years. As he drifted off in the chair, he heard her whisper something in the dark, speaking in her own tongue. He didn't understand the words, but he caught one sound. His name, Silas, spoken soft and grateful by a woman to a man who hadn't been thanked in years. It felt like the beginning of something, and it scared him more than the river ever had. By the time another week had passed, the ridge was buried. The cabin stood half-hidden beneath the weight of the snow, the only sign of life the steady curl of smoke from its chimney. The storm outside was just noise to Silas Thorne. He'd lived through worse. But this winter felt different. He wasn't alone anymore, and every choice he made had to account for someone else. Inside, Tali had settled into the rhythm of the cabin. She could move herself from the cot to the chair with her arms now, and she helped with whatever work she could reach. She sorted beans, patched torn shirts with careful stitches, and ground coffee with her hands steady against the stone. Her legs didn't move, but her spirit did, and Silas noticed it more each day. It was a hard thing to square how a paralyzed woman could have lasted so long on her own. That morning, when the snow outside softened the light, he asked her that question for the first time. How did you live before the river? She paused, the motion of her hand stopping over the cloth she was mending. A man from my tribe, old uncle, he bring me food, you were for a time. When he die, they stop. I crawl to creek for water, no food, no people. One day they come. I think maybe they bring help. They say, spirit, take my legs. Say I make sickness. They carry me to water, throw. Her voice didn't shake, but the words did something to him. He tightened his jaw, staring at the floor for a long while. They thought killing you would fix them, he said quietly. Yes, she said, but I still hear. He nodded, meeting her eyes. Damn right you are. It was the first time she'd heard him curse, and something in his tone made her lips twitch, the faintest spark of amusement, like life reclaiming space where pain used to live. That evening, as he chopped outside, he saw a shape down the ridge, a horse moving slow through the snow. His hand went to his gun by instinct. Travelers rarely came this way unless they were lost or looking for something. The horse stopped near the fence line, a man dismounting wrapped in a long coat and scarf. Silas waited until he got close enough to see his face. It was old Ezra, Dunn, the trader who ran a small outpost 15 miles east. Didn't expect to see anyone out this way, Thorne, Silas said, lowering his guard. Ezra nodded, stamping snow from his boots. Had a delivery for some folks down the river. Figured I'd check if you were still breathing. Silas smirked faintly. Still am. Ezra looked past him toward the cabin. Heard a rumor out in town. Said you took in one of them Apache women, true? Silas's jaw tightened. Who's saying that? Couple drifters in Pine Ford. Saw smoke from this ridge and said maybe you weren't as alone as you used to be. Silas didn't answer right away. He just said, she needed help, that's all. Ezra gave him a long look, part curious, part cautious. Help's one thing, Thorne. Trouble's another. Folks out there don't forgive easy. I didn't ask for their forgiveness, Silas said. Ezra nodded, understanding enough not to push further. He handed over a small sack of coffee and salt. You're going to want to keep that fire strong. Weather's turning bad again. When Ezra rode off, Silas stood there for a long time, watching the horse disappear into the white. The unease sat heavy in his chest. If men in Pine Ford were already talking, it meant someone had seen Tali, or would soon. He went back inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. Tali looked up from her chair. Someone come? He hesitated before answering. Trader, just passing through. She studied his face, knowing there was more. You worry, she said quietly. Silas didn't deny it. This land's not kind to strangers. Word spreads fast. Folks in town, most of them don't see right from wrong when it comes to your people. She looked down, her voice calm but firm. I not go back. He stepped closer, resting a hand on the table beside her. You won't. I'll see to that. Something in his tone carried a weight he hadn't meant to reveal. She looked up, her eyes catching his, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The fire popped between them. He felt something shift, something quiet but real. A line crossed, a promise made without words. Later, when she slept, Silas sat near the window, watching the snow drift against the glass. He thought about what he'd said. He meant every word. But the truth was, he didn't know how to protect her if men came asking. The town barely tolerated him. A quiet man with no family and a past he never spoke of. An Apache woman under his roof would stir the kind of talk that never ended well. He looked over at her sleeping form, her face soft in the glow of the firelight, and felt a pull he didn't know how to name. Something heavier than pity, deeper than duty. She had become part of the place, part of his days. The cabin didn't feel hollow anymore. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was full of something steady, something alive. Silas leaned back, the fire's warmth brushing his face. He had lived years with no one to answer to, no reason to stay. But as he watched her breathe, he realized the thought of her being taken or leaving was something he couldn't accept. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge, sweeping through the trees like a warning. Inside, the man who once swore never to care again had already broken his own vow without noticing. The wind carried harder the next morning, driving sheets of snow against the cabin walls. Silas was up before dawn, pulling on his coat and stepping outside to check the livestock. He moved slow, every step sinking deep in the drift. The storm had buried most of the fence line and left the roof heavy with white. His mind stayed busy with work, but under it all was that same gnawing thought. If the trader could find his way here, so could others. When he came back in, the fire had died low. Tali sat awake in her chair near the stove, wrapped in a blanket, hair loose over her shoulders. She looked tired, but alert. He noticed the way her eyes followed him, studying, the tension in his movements. "You no sleep much," she said softly. "Could say the same for you," he replied, kneeling to stoke the fire. "I hear storm, think maybe roof fall." He gave a faint smile. "If it falls, we'll rebuild. It wouldn't be the first time." Her gaze lingered on him a moment longer before she spoke again. "The man who come yesterday, you trust him, Ezra?" He shrugged. "As much as anyone. He's not cruel, just curious. But word travels fast and men talk faster when they drink." Tali looked down, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "If men come, they take me again." "No," he said too quickly. Then quieter. "Not while I'm standing." It wasn't just something he said to calm her. He meant it, somewhere between that frozen night by the river and this morning's silence. His sense of duty had turned into something else, something heavier. Silas moved about the room, checking the windows, the latch on the door, the rifle hanging by the wall. He caught himself doing it again later that day, listening too often for sounds outside, glancing at the ridgeline through the window. He hadn't realized until then how much his life had shifted in only a few weeks. The world beyond that cabin felt smaller now, meaner. He'd built his life on distance. Distance from the war, from people, from the things he couldn't fix. But now, there was someone inside his walls who needed him to stay close. By noon, the storm broke. The light changed, soft and gold against the snow. He went to the shed and came back carrying a rough wooden frame. "What that?" Tali asked. "Something I've been working on," he said, setting it near her. "Figured you could use some freedom." It was a small chair with handles, rough but sturdy. He'd fashioned it from scrap lumber, attaching small wheels from an old plow. "You can move easier with it," he explained. Her eyes widened as she ran her hand along the edge of the wood. "You make for me." "Seemed about time," he said, awkward, under her stare. "You shouldn't have to drag yourself everywhere." She looked at the chair, then at him. "You're a kind man, Silas Thorne," she whispered. He shook his head, uncomfortable with the words. "Just a man who's handy with wood." But the feeling lingered. When he settled her into the rough-hewn chair, and she rolled forward under her own power for the first time, the sound of her quiet laugh filled the cabin. It was a sound he hadn't heard before, and it caught him square in the chest, loosening something knotted tight inside him. She moved around the room, slow but determined, her hands reaching out to touch things she'd only seen from the cot. The shelf of tools, the rough-sawn window frame, the small stack of books by the door. She stopped at the window, looking out at the endless, blinding white. "I forget world big," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "It's not as big as it used to be. Why you stay here?" she asked suddenly. "You strong man. You could live anywhere." Silas leaned his shoulder against the wall, turning the question over in his mind. "I used to think peace meant running from everything," he said. "Turns out running just makes you tired." She nodded slowly, her eyes showing she understood more than he'd said. "You find peace here?" He met her gaze for a long beat. "Maybe starting to." The day passed in that same quiet. He was up on the roof, patching shingles while she prepared a stew. Their movements wove around each other, a rhythm that felt natural, as if they'd been sharing this small space for years, not weeks. When he came back inside, the cabin was filled with a rich, warm smell that wasn't just wood smoke. They ate together by the fire. For the first time since she'd arrived, Tali didn't look like a stranger in his home. The blanket draped around. Her shoulders looked like it belonged there. Her face had color back in it. "Your people," he said into the silence. "You think they'll come looking for you?" She shook her head. "They say I died. Spirit already gone. If they see me, now they turn away. Then you're free," he said. She looked at him, her eyes serious. Free, but nowhere to go. He met her eyes squarely. Then you stay here, till you decide otherwise. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of his words on a scale. Then she gave a single firm nod. I stay. The fire crackled in the silence. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world muted, still and white. Silas leaned back in his chair, watching her hands rest calmly on the blanket, the firelight painting her skin amber. It hit him right then, how quiet the world had become and how much that quiet meant. There was no loneliness in it, no sharp ache of the past, just the steady sound of breathing, the snap of the fire, and the feeling of something new and fragile, taking root. Tali caught him watching and gave him a faint, knowing smile. He looked away quick, pretending to adjust the stove damper, but his heart gave a hard thump against his ribs. The night settled in slow. When she finally drifted to sleep, Silas sat there for a long time, staring into the embers as the fire burned low. He thought of the life he'd lived before her. Empty days, empty nights. A man just waiting for nothing. Then he looked toward the cot where she slept, her dark hair a shadow on the pillow, and he realized the waiting was over. Whatever came next, town rumors, trouble from the ridge, more snow, or just silence, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting her face it alone. The days after the storm passed with a strange, heavy calm. The snow outside hardened into a brittle crust that shattered the morning light like glass. Inside, the cabin breathed differently. The air, no longer, felt like it belonged to just one man. There were 2 mugs by the stove, 2 sets of footprints melting near the door, 2 lives, circling each other in a quiet, steady rhythm. Silas had always worked with purpose, but lately, that purpose had shifted. He wasn't just keeping himself alive anymore. He was making sure Tali had what she needed. He hauled water, split wood, and set traps for rabbit. She prepared their food, mended his clothes, and kept the fire fed and steady. Their world had narrowed down to survival and silence, and somehow, that felt right. It was a fair question, whether anyone had come looking for her, her tribe, the townsfolk, someone from her past. Silas had wondered too. Every time the wind carried a sound that didn't belong, his hand would drift toward his rifle. But weeks passed without a sign. The river below was now frozen solid at its edges, the nearest road buried deep in snow. It was as if the world had sealed them off, leaving them to themselves. One evening, while Silas sat by the fire mending a busted saddle strap, Tali spoke quietly from her chair. You not asked what I think of you. He looked up, surprised by the turn. Didn't think I had to. You think I afraid, she said. First days, yes. You quiet man, always look like a storm in your head, but you no hurt me, not even once. Silas's jaw tightened, his fingers stilling on the leather. You've seen men who did. Her eyes darkened. Too many. She paused, her fingers tracing the wool seam of the blanket. Before the river Ishan, there was one man. He said he loved me. After I fall from horse, he call me broken thing. Say I am no woman, if no walk. He tell others I am cursed. That is why they turn. Silas's grip on the strap went white. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was low and rough. Sounds to me like he was the one cursed. She studied his face, her eyes soft but sharp. You not believe in curse. He shook his head, the movement slow. I've seen bad men and I've seen good men. I've seen storms and I've seen war. I ain't never seen a curse do a damn thing that people didn't do to each other first. Something in her expression shifted, part relief, part raw wonder. You different kind, she said quietly. He leaned back, uncomfortable. Don't know about that. I'm just tired of watching people get thrown away. The next morning he woke early to find her already up, sitting near the window in her chair. The sky was a flat gray, and frost laced the glass. She was sewing something small and careful, using strips she'd cut from one of his old shirts. When he asked what she was doing, she held it up. "You always fix things," she said. "Now I fix you one." It was a small pouch, stitched tight with rawhide thread. "For your tobacco." He took it from her hand, his rough fingers brushing hers for just a second. "That's good work." She smiled faintly. "You keep." "So, you not forget woman you save." He looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than he expected. "I couldn't forget if I tried, Tali." As the day wore on, he busied himself checking traps along the tree line. When he returned, he found her reading one of the few books he owned. Her brow was furrowed as she traced the words with her finger. "You read English?" he asked, surprised. "Learn from missionary woman," she said without looking up. "Long time ago, before tribe and sent her away." He crouched beside her chair, pointing to a line in the book. "That word there," he said. "It means freedom." She repeated it softly, testing the feel of it. "Freedom." Then she smiled, a small but certain thing. "I like that word." That night they ate by the fire, the room warm against the cold pressing in from outside. The talk drifted to small things, the sharp smell of pines after rain, the way coyotes called to each other in the dark. She asked about the scars on his hands, and he told her bits of his past he hadn't spoken aloud in years. About the war, about losing men he'd called brothers, about how silence was the only thing that ever answered him back. "You think you're done with fighting?" she asked after a while. "I thought so," he admitted, staring into the flames. "But maybe fighting just changes shape. These days it's not men I'm fighting, it's myself." She reached out, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed her hand over his, her fingers warm against the rough, scarred knuckles. He didn't move. Neither spoke. The fire popped once, throwing a spray of embers. For the first time in years, Silas didn't feel the crushing weight of his past. He just felt something steady, like the ground had finally stopped shifting beneath his feet. Outside, the night deepened. A cold wind slid down the ridge, rattling the walls. But inside, the air stayed warm. Tali's hand stayed on his. When she finally withdrew it, he felt the absence like a pulse. Before he turned in for the night, he checked the door one last time. The wind had picked up again, the kind that carried sound far, somewhere beyond the ridge. He thought he heard the echo of hooves, faint, distant, but real. He stood there for a long while, listening. Then he looked back at her, sleeping by the fire, and something in his chest tightened. Trouble might be coming, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, he wasn't running from it this time. The river had taken one life from her and nearly claimed his peace along with it. But now, standing in that cabin's quiet light, Silas Thorne knew exactly what he was willing to fight for. By dawn, the sound of hooves was no longer a dream. Silas had heard them again just before sunrise, closer this time, steady and deliberate. Whoever was riding was not lost. He stood by the window, the rifle in his hands, his breath clouding the glass as he watched the ridge below. The tracks were faint through the snow, but there were at least 2 horses, maybe 3, moving slow along the frozen riverbank. He watched until they vanished into the tree line, then turned toward the fire where Tali was stirring awake. She saw the rifle, first then his face. "Someone come?" He nodded once. "Could be nothing. Could be men from Pine Ford. I don't like it either way." Her eyes darkened. "They look for me." "Don't know yet," he said, "but if they are, they'll find the wrong cabin to knock on." He tried to sound steady, but the weight in his voice gave him away. The people of Pine Ford weren't known for mercy, especially toward Apache. They called it justice when it suited them, and savagery when it didn't. If word had spread that Silas Thorne, a man already half an outsider, was harboring one, it would draw attention he didn't want. He moved through the cabin, checking the door, the window latches, the back wall where he'd patched old bullet holes years ago. His hands shook only slightly. Tali watched him in silence, her eyes following every motion. "You fight before," she said quietly. He looked at her, Too many times. She nodded, understanding without asking. You not want to fight again? No, he said, but I will if I have to. While he loaded the rifle, she turned her chair toward him. If men come, I hide. He shook his head. No. If anyone comes, they'll see we got nothing to hide. You're here because I want you here. That's the truth. Tali stared at him for a long time. You risk your life for me. Why? Silas stopped what he was doing, for a moment. All he could hear was the ticking of the stove metal cooling. Because it's the right damn thing, he said, quietly. And because I'd rather die doing something that matters than live like I used to, pretending I didn't care who got left behind. That answer hung heavy in the small room. She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. Then I hope they never find us. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The day moved slow after that. The wind outside carried no new sounds, but both of them stayed tense. Silas stepped out only once to gather wood. When he returned, she had prepared coffee and laid out 2 bowls of stew. He could tell by the look in her eyes that she understood more than he said, that she knew what was coming, and that she wasn't afraid. As evening fell, he told her the story she'd never asked for but probably wondered about since the day he found her. You asked once why I came out here, he said. Why live alone? She nodded, watching him from her chair. I used to ride with men who were paid to kill other men. Didn't matter why, didn't matter who. I told myself I was doing it for a reason. Money, justice, some kind of order. But I was just running from the noise in my own head. One job went bad. My friend, closest thing I had to a brother, took a bullet meant for me. After that, I rode west and kept going until there was no one left to bury. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. Thought I could live quiet up here. But quiet don't fix what's broken. It just makes you forget it's still there. Tali didn't interrupt, just let the words settle. When he finished, she said softly, You fix me, maybe I fix you. He met her gaze, the truth of it hitting him hard. You already did. The quiet that followed wasn't heavy. It was the kind that settles between 2 people who have finally said what needed saying. That night, the snow began again, faint at first, then thickening, muffling the world outside. Silas sat near the fire while Tali slept, his rifle leaning by his chair, but the gnawing fear was gone. If those riders came, he'd deal with them. He wasn't protecting a secret anymore. He was protecting his home. Near midnight, the dogs in the shed erupted. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his heart tightening. Through the frost-blurred window, he saw 2 shapes approaching, the bobbing glow of lanterns moving between the trees. He crossed the room, in 2 strides, and checked the rifle's action. Stay here, he told her. Silas, she said softly. Please, no kill. He gave her a look that was half promise, half warning. Only if they make me. He stepped outside into the biting cold, his boots crunching over the snow. The wind hit his face like a pane of glass. 2 men were coming up the ridge, one on horseback, one leading another. The closer they came, the more he recognized the man in front. Ezra Dunn, the traitor. Silas lowered the rifle slightly. You've got a habit of showing up uninvited, Ezra. The older man raised a hand. Didn't come for trouble, Thorne. Came to warn you. Couple of deputies from Pine Ford are heading this way. They heard talk you're harboring a woman from the reservation. Said they're coming to check. Silas's jaw tightened. How long? Tomorrow morning. Maybe sooner, Ezra said. They're drinking first. You know how that goes. Silas nodded, his mind already turning over the options. Appreciate the warning. Ezra hesitated before leaving. Thorne, I don't know what's going on between you and that woman, but if she's innocent, you better have proof. Pine Ford ain't kind to men who take in outsiders. Silas's voice came out flat. She's not an outsider here. Ezra gave him one long look, then turned his horse back down the trail. When the sound of hooves faded, Silas went back inside. Tali was still awake, her eyes fixed on the door. They come. He nodded. Tomorrow. Her voice trembled slightly. They take me away. No, he said. I won't let them. Then they kill you. She whispered. He knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. Then they'll have to earn it. Her fingers tightened around his. I not want you die for me. He looked up at her, his voice steady. You gave me something to live for again, Tali. That's not dying. That's living right. For the first time. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, carrying a low, distant thunder. He didn't know if it was the storm or the echo of horses on frozen ground. But either way, he knew what tomorrow would bring. He spent the rest of the night preparing, moving the rifle near the window, checking the fire, securing the door. When he finally sat down beside her again, her eyes were open, watching him. You tired? He asked. No, she said softly. I think maybe peace before storm. I feel it here. She pressed a hand to her chest. He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Neither of them slept. When the first light of morning broke over the ridge, the snow was still falling, slow, quiet, endless. And down below, the faint shapes of riders appeared through the fog. 3 this time, moving toward the cabin with purpose. Silas stood, his hand tightening around the rifle. The sound of hooves grew louder, clearer. He took one last look at Tali. She met his eyes, calm and unflinching, and whispered, I stay. I know, he said. As the horses stopped outside, Silas stepped to the door. Whatever ghosts of his past still lived in him, whatever guilt he carried, they fell silent now. All that mattered was the woman by the fire, the life they'd built out of nothing, and the fact that for the first time in years he wasn't running from the fight. He was making a stand for something worth saving. The knock came hard against the wood, a sharp, demanding sound. Silas exhaled once, slow and steady, and pulled the door open. The door swung wide to the flat gray morning, revealing 3 men outside, their horses blowing steam into the frigid air. Snow caked their hats and coats, and their boots were sunk, deep in the drift. The man in front wore a deputy's badge pinned crooked to his vest, his face chapped red from a mix of drink and cold. The other 2 hung back, rifles slung over their shoulders. Silas didn't move from the doorway. Morning, the deputy said, his tone hard with suspicion. Name's Quint Bodine. You Silas Thorne? I am, Silas said evenly. Bodine's gaze shifted, past Silas's shoulder, his eyes narrowing as if he could see right through the cabin walls. We heard you got company up here, an Apache woman. Folks in Pine Fort are curious if that's true. Silas's voice stayed calm. You rode all this way just to trade gossip? Bodine gave a humorless grin. Not gossip, Thorne. Law. There's been trouble near the reservation, livestock gone missing, traps cut. Even a fire set near one of the mining camps. Apache tracks all over the place. If you got one in there, she's going to answer some questions. Silas's hand tightened on the doorframe, but his face stayed blank. You're barking up the wrong ridge. Ain't been any Apache around here since winter started. Bodine tilted his head. That's so? Mind if we look inside, just to be sure? You got a warrant? Don't need one, Bodine said, stepping forward. Not when it's tribal business. Silas blocked his way. The air between them thickened. You step through that door uninvited, and you'll find it's not tribal business anymore. It's mine. For a long moment, nobody moved. Snow hissed softly against the roof rail, and the horses shifted behind them, stamping at the cold. The 2 men behind Bodine looked uneasy, like they didn't want this to turn ugly. Briggs spat into the snow. You always were a hard bastard, Thorne. Heard stories about you from the war. Men said you'd rather shoot than talk. Silas's eyes didn't flinch. Depends who's asking. Bodine smiled thinly, no humor in it. You got till sundown to change her mind. If she's here when we come back, she's coming with us. You think about that. He turned his horse, motioning to the others, and they rode off through the snow, their silhouettes fading into the trees. Silas watched until they disappeared, then shut the door slow, his breath fogging in the cold air. Tali was still by the fire, her eyes wide, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "They take me," she whispered. "Not if I can help it," he said. "But they'll be back." She swallowed hard. "If I leave now, they stop, they forget." He shook his head. "You won't make it a mile in this cold, and they won't forget. They'll just come for both of us later." She looked down, her voice trembling. "You fight them. They kill you. I don't want this." Silas crouched beside her. "You listen to me. You didn't do anything wrong. They're looking for someone to blame, that's all. Men like that, they don't need proof. Just someone weaker to point at. You stay here, I'll handle them." She stared at him, tears brimming in her eyes but not falling. "You not afraid to die?" He gave a small, tired smile. "I've been afraid of a lot of things in my life. Dying stopped being one of them a long time ago." She reached for his hand, fingers trembling but strong. "Then I afraid for you." He looked down at her hand, her skin warm against his, and for a moment the world outside stopped existing. He spent the next hours preparing not for a fight, but for a chance. He checked the rifle, the revolver, and the rounds. He gathered food, packed a small bag, and brought in more wood for the fire. Tali watched him, saying nothing. She knew what it meant. When night came, the wind dropped. The snow had stopped, falling, leaving the sky clear and sharp. Silas sat by the window, eyes fixed on the valley below, waiting for the flicker of lanterns. They came just past midnight. 3 of them again, their lights moving slow and steady up the ridge. He stood, grabbed his rifle, and looked at her. "Stay quiet, don't move from that chair." She nodded, her face pale in the firelight. When the knock came, it wasn't polite this time. It was the hard, flat sound of men who'd already decided how the night would end. Silas opened the door halfway. Quint Bodine stood there again, his face tight with cold and anger. "Didn't figure. You'd do the smart thing," he said. Silas's voice stayed low. "I told you. There's no one here you need to see." Bodine shifted his coat, revealing the pistol at his side. "Move, Thorne." Silas didn't. Behind him, the fire popped. One of the other men craned his neck, trying to see inside. "There's someone in there," he said. Bodine's mouth twisted. "So it's true." He reached for the door, and that was all it took. Silas stepped forward, his hand slamming the door open hard enough to knock Bodine back a step. The rifle came up, not to fire, just leveled. "You got 3 seconds to turn around and get off this ridge," Silas said, his voice cold as the air. "You come any closer and you won't make it to your horses." Bodine's men hesitated. The second one muttered, "Let's go, Clem. Ain't worth it." But Bodine wasn't the kind to back down. "You think you can stand against the law?" he hissed. Silas's voice didn't rise. "You're not the law out here, you're just another man with a gun." They stared at each other. The tension stretched thin as wire. Finally, Bodine spat again, his breath a cloud in the cold. "You'll regret this, Thorne." He turned, motioning his men to follow. They mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing into the black ridge below. Silas stayed in the doorway long after they were gone, rifle still in his hands until the only sound left was the wind. Inside, Tali was crying quietly, not from fear but from something deeper, a grief that had no words. "They come again," she said softly. "Maybe," he answered, "but not tonight." She looked at him, tears streaking her cheeks. "You protect me. Like I'm worth something." "You are," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." She reached out and he came closer, kneeling beside her. She touched his face gently, fingers tracing the scar at his temple. "You fight for me," she whispered. "No one fight for me before." Silas caught her hand and held it there. "Then I guess it's about time." The cabin was silent except for the fire crackling. The storm outside had gone, but inside something else had settled. a fragile peace, born from defiance. She leaned forward, then her breath trembling. He didn't move away. Her fingers brushed his jaw, and when she spoke, her voice was barely more than a breath. You don't need save me anymore. I stay because I want. Silas's chest tightened, the kind of feeling he hadn't let himself have in years. He reached up his rough hand against her cheek. Then stay, he said quietly. She closed the space between them, her lips finding his. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was real, grounded, alive. The kind of kiss that made every scar and silence worth it. When they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his. You not alone now? She said softly. He nodded, eyes still closed. No, I'm not. Outside, the snow glittered in the pale moonlight. The danger wasn't gone, but for that night the world had gone still. Inside the small cabin on the ridge, two broken souls had finally stopped running, from death, from fear, from themselves. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it together. The morning came slow, pale and cold, the light creeping over the snow like a thin sheet of silver. The air outside was silent. No voices, no horses, no trace of the men who had come the night. Silas stood by the window, watching the line of the ridge for any sign of movement. His rifle leaned against the wall beside him, his jaw tight, but his eyes steady. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that knock again, saw Bodine's face red and twisted with arrogance. But now, in the quiet dawn, nothing stirred. Just the smoke curling from the chimney and the faint crackle of the fire behind him. Tali was awake, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes following him quietly. They gone, she said, her voice still rough from the night before. For now, Silas answered. He turned from the window, walking toward her. She looked different in the morning light, stronger somehow, even with the blanket pulled tight around her. You think they come back? She asked. He hesitated before answering. Maybe. Men like that don't take kindly to being told no. But if they do, I'll be ready. Her brow furrowed. You can't fight a whole town, Silas Thorne. He gave a faint, hard smile. Never tried fighting a whole town before, but I'll fight for what's mine. She looked at him for a long moment, her voice quiet. Am I yours? The question caught him off guard. He set his hat on the table and crouched beside her. Not because you owe me, not because I saved you, you're yours, Tali, but if you choose to stay here, if you want this life with me, then yeah, you're mine in every way that matters. Her eyes filled with tears, but not from fear. It was something deeper, recognition, relief, a love she didn't know how to name. She reached for his hand. Then, I stay. Silas nodded, gripping her hand in both of his. Then we start new. That morning they worked together as if nothing had happened. He carried water from the well, brought in more firewood, and cleared the heavy snow from the shed roof. Tali moved slowly around the cabin in the chair he had built her, mending, his torn shirts, cooking breakfast, keeping herself busy like she belonged there, and she did. For the first time since the river, laughter filled the cabin, small, quiet, but real. She teased him when he burned the bread, and he smirked when she scolded him for tracking snow across the floor. The tension that had hung between them for weeks finally eased like ice thawing in the sun. Yet beneath it all, both of them knew this peace was fragile. Sooner or later, someone would ride up that ridge again. By midday, the sun broke through, warming the snow just enough to make it sparkle. Silas decided to ride down toward the ridge to see if Bodine and his men had camped nearby. He saddled his horse, checking the cinch strap twice. I'll be gone an hour, he told her. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. Tali nodded but caught his sleeve before he could turn away. You come back, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Promise? He rested a hand on her cheek. I'll come back. She watched him ride off until he disappeared through the pines. The cabin fell silent again, except for the wind. She waited, eyes fixed on the window, her heart pounding at every sound. It was nearly an hour later when she saw him returning, but he wasn't alone. Another rider trailed behind, older, riding slow. For a moment her chest seized with fear. Then she recognized Ezra's long coat. Silas dismounted first, helping the old trader down. When they stepped inside, Ezra Dunn tipped his hat toward Tali. "Didn't mean to worry you, miss, just thought Thorne might like to know. Pineford's had its fill of trouble. Bodine won't be back." Silas frowned. "What happened?" Ezra sighed. "Bodine tried to raise men to come after you. Sheriff told him to leave it be. Said the county's got bigger problems than one quiet cowboy. Keeping to himself. Heard Bodine rode east last night, mad as hell." Silas leaned back against the wall, the breath he'd been holding finally easing out. "So it's done." "Looks that way," Ezra said. "I told the sheriff, the woman you've got here is no danger to anyone." He didn't care enough to argue. Tali looked from one man to the other, still processing the words. "He not come back?" "No," Silas said. "You're safe now." Ezra stayed for coffee, trading a few supplies before heading back down the ridge. When the door closed behind Ezra, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was lighter, freer. Tali wheeled her chair closer to the window, watching the sky brighten over the snow-covered ridge. "So no one chase us now?" she asked. "No one," Silas said. She looked at him, the corners of her mouth turning up in a slow, real smile. "Then we live here?" "Yes," he said. "Not just hide." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, we live." In the days that followed, the hard air finally softened. The snow began to melt back from the cabin's edges and birdsong returned to the trees. Silas repaired the barn roof, patched the fence line, and built a small ramp so Tali could move her chair outside. When the ground firmed up, each night they sat by the fire and the words came easier now. She spoke of her childhood by this same Verde River, of a brother lost in a raid, of the smell of desert rain. He told her about the war, about the men he couldn't save, and about the long, hollow years that followed. She just listened, never judging, never pushing for more than he was ready to give. As the true spring arrived, the land came alive again. Wildflowers pushed up through the thawing earth and the river ran fast and clean. One morning Silas found her by the porch, her hands locked onto the railing. She had pulled herself out of the chair, her legs trembling violently, her arms shaking with the strain. "Hey," he said, moving forward. She held up a hand, stopping him. "I try," she said through clenched teeth. "I stand. Today." He moved closer, one arm ready to catch her, but he didn't touch, waiting for her signal. Slowly, fighting for it, she found her balance. Her knees locked just enough to take her weight. She swayed, once, twice, then held steady. Silas felt his own breath catch. "You're doing it, Tali." Her eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. A real, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. "I walk again, one day." He felt something break loose in his chest, something he'd kept locked down for years. He pulled her close, holding her tight as her arms locked strong around his neck. "You will," he said, his voice thick. "You already are." That evening they sat together on the porch, watching the sun bleed gold and fire across the hills. Below them, the river whispered over the rocks, the same river that had tried to claim her, but now just carried the sound of peace. Tali leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "You saved me once," she said. "Now, we save each other." He wrapped his arm around her, his voice low. "That's how it's supposed to be." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of pine and thawing earth. Behind them, the cabin glowed with the warm light of the fire inside, and for the first time since either of them could remember, there was nothing to run from and nothing to fear. Silas looked out over the land that had once been just dust and silence, and he saw life. His herd grazing on the new grass, smoke curling from his chimney, and Tali beside him, alive, smiling, and home. He didn't need words to understand it. The ridge, the river, the woman, they were all one. Everything broken inside him had finally found its place. As the last light faded from the sky, she whispered, "You think we stay here forever?" He smiled. "As long as the river runs." And in that small cabin above the Verde, with the fire warm at their backs and the sound of the world steady and alive again, Silas Thorne finally found what he had been chasing his entire life. Peace. Not the kind that came from running, but the kind that came from staying. The river had almost taken her, but now it carried their story forward, calm and endless, into a world that had finally forgiven them both.